Hello, y'all. This is Rabbit Hot Rose here. And to start things off, before we get into the book, I've written my first Expression from the Heart. It's on Amazon.com. Duh. I'll try to find it for you so I can send you down the link. The link for it. It's also available on Kindle. Oh, let me get that for you right quick. Got it. I'm going to put it in the comment section. Uh, that and this. Spelled together. Okay. Okay, let's get on to reading. Xena at the Battle of Salamis by J. Cameron. Gabrielle, please tell me a story, begged Annette, a 12-year-old beauty, as Gabrielle looked into her young blue eyes. She could almost see her own sister Lila more than anyone else. Annette hungered for Gabrielle's tales of Xena and the way of the warrior, and the girl pestered Gabrielle for stories as soon as the bard sat by the fire. What shall I tell you about this time? Laughed Gabrielle. Tell me again how Xena saved me from both my cruel father and the arms of Poseidon, and brought me here to live with you. Gabrielle began to speak, using the sing-song, low-pitched voice of the storyteller. As she spoke, the fog that crept in toward their campfire seemed to disappear, and the hoar frost that was already settling on the twigs seemed to melt. Annette could almost feel the soft, salt air of the Aegean Sea, and see the hills of the Greek mainland as they captured the sunlight that was so brilliant in that part of the Mediterranean. 10 years ago, Xena still considered herself an apprentice in the way of the warrior. She had mastered the weapons of the land and was skilled at the strategies that brought to victories in the forest, hills, and plains. Now the way led her to the sea, where the sleek fighting ships sped with the dolphins through the deep waters. Xena had heard tales of a mighty queen in the Persian Empire named Artemisia, who was said to be one of the most brilliant admirals in the fleet of the great king Xerxes. Xena wanted to join her and learn her secrets, but she never imagined that on Artemisia's ship she would fight one of the greatest naval battles the world had ever known, or that she would fight against her old friends, the Greeks. Xena traveled to the northern shore of the Aegean Sea and reached the Hellespont, that narrow strip of water that separated the Aegean from a great inland sea with water so dark people called it the Black Sea. The warrior princess at first looked for a small boat to charter to cross the Hellespont, but then she thought again. If she were going to learn the secrets of naval warfare, she would be prepared to survive the sea's challenges. This forbidding spot where the tide swept the water through narrow, rocky straits would be a perfect test for her. She offered a prayer to the sea god Poseidon and dove into churning waves. The waters from the Aegean Sea, warmed by the Mediterranean sun, were not as cold as those of the northern lakes, where Xena had first learned the strong strokes that pulled her through the current. But the bite of the salt surprised her, for it is even saltier than the great oceans that surround her land. As she rhythmically swam through the current, she tried not to think of the stories she had heard of monsters who lived in the deep, salty water. Storytellers told of sailors who had been pulled into the wine dark sea by beasts with tentacles like snakes that held the power of 6 men. Others told of great fish whose teeth could break through the strongest bone. Xena had learned not to recoil from such fearful thoughts, but instead to embrace them. Her warrior nature almost made her wish for a monster to challenge her, so she could prove her great strength. Well, actually, she thought honestly, I'd probably have to depend on my quick wits to defeat the great sea beast, if they are truly as formidable as the poets say. Engaged by these thoughts, and almost hypnotized by the strong swimming strokes, Xena crossed the 2 miles of the straits and climbed onto the rocks at the shore. The salty water dried quickly on her skin as she stood in the sun, leaving white crystals on her tanned body. I'm going to dive into the nearest river, even if it is as cold as the North Sea, to wash the salt off, Xena thought. Poseidon can keep his salty, monster-filled home. She then started walking south along the eastern edge of the Aegean toward Artemisia's kingdom. Xena soon came to the kingdom of the Lydians, who had become fabulously wealthy with their invention of a wondrous thing. Instead of trading for goods, the Lydians had taken precious metals, silver and gold, and formed them into regular round pieces with the imprint of their kings and gods. These they called coins and used them to trade for whatever they needed. This system was so convenient for merchants that Lydia had become a crossroads for travelers seeking to sell their goods. These coins were so wondrous that the Persians had adopted them to use throughout their empire, and even the Greeks were starting to make some of their own. Xena shook her head in some disapproval as she passed his Lydian merchant guarded by Many are men. People now kill to steal these coins, she said to no one in particular. There would always be work for those who followed the way of the warrior. 6 days after she had crossed the Hellespont, Xena had covered the 200 miles that brought her to the kingdom of Caria, on the southwestern edge of Asia Minor. She slowly traveled south to the city of Halicarnassus to present herself to Queen Artemisia. Like Lydia and many other small kingdoms, Caria was part of the great Persian Empire, and the Persian kings had wisely allowed their subject peoples to keep their own customs and rulers. In this way, they ensured the loyalty of most. And this is how Artemisia continued to be queen while belonging to the empire. For this trip, Xena was not exploring the far-flung lands of the empire, which encompassed exotic peoples and animals. Her single-minded goal was the huge naval yard where Xerxes had spent a vast fortune building the greatest navy the world had ever known, and where Artemisia served as admiral in the great king's navy. As Xena slowly traveled with, she became aware that all was not peaceful in Caria. Centuries before, Greek colonists had established city-states on the coast of the kingdoms that bordered the eastern Aegean. Like Greeks everywhere, the enterprising colonists had focused on trade and accumulating these new coins that the Lydians had made famous. However, also like Greeks everywhere, these on the edge of the Persian Empire were fiercely independent. The Persians had been willing to leave the Greeks pretty much to themselves, but they installed pro-Persian leaders in the city-states. The Greeks resented even this level of interference, and a few years before Xena's arrival, some of the city-states had revolted against Persian rule. The rebellion had begun in Miletus, a rich coastal city in Artemisia's kingdom. The Persians had crushed the revolt and virtually destroyed Miletus, but they did not bring peace. Xena heard excited stories from Greeks in the shoreline villages. Athens and Sparta on the mainland would avenge their defeat. Greeks would never live subject to the shame of barbarian rule, and would rise up to smite the Persians. Xena also heard complaints in Persian villages where people resented the arrogant Greeks who would not learn their lesson. The warrior princess shook her head as she again saw people eager to fight. Why didn't Xena leave that region since war was brewing? Anit asked, briefly breaking the storytelling spell that Gabrielle was weaving. Did you ever see Xena be moved from her purpose simply because of a fight? The bard answered. I was more worried than Xena, and I wasn't even there. I had vivid dreams in which I saw Poseidon rear out of the sea and smashed and smashed ships to kindling. And I saw Aphrodite weep because people were too busy killing each other to make love. I tried to call to Xena in my dreams and my thoughts, and though she told me later that she had dreamed of me, she did not return. Now let me get back to my story and tell you of the court of Queen Artemisia. Xena entered the courtyard of the great palace at Halicarnassus and admired the gardens and fountains that graced the huge entryway. The doorway to the palace itself was a great archway covered in thinly pounded gold. So when the setting sun shone on it, the brilliance almost blinded any late afternoon visitor. Xena had known that there were many wealthy, independent women in the Persian Empire, and she now could see that Artemisia, Queen of Caria, was one of the wealthiest. Caria lay next to wealthy Lydia and had fine ports on the Mediterranean to serve the growing trade from the Greek city-states. The shrewd queen knew how to make the most of her kingdom's location, but her prosperity depended on good relations with the Greeks. The rumors Xena had heard seemed to threaten these ties, but the great queen seemed unperturbed when she greeted Xena in the magnificent hall of her palace. Xena, my warrior sister, welcome to Caria. Tales of your adventures have reached our lands from the songs of traveling poets, and I'm delighted to meet you in person. Artemisia was dressed in the flowing robes of Persian women made of light blue silk, so finely spun that they seemed almost transparent. Her hair was as dark as Xena's own, but was piled on her head in a mound of curls crowned with a finely wrought gold band. As delicate as Artemisia appeared, Xena was not deluded into underestimating her. When the queen gave Xena a welcoming hug, the warrior princess could feel Artemisia's strong arms and shoulders. Artemisia was as formidable a warrior as Xena herself, but more experienced in naval warfare. Xena was hungry to go beyond the necessary pleasantries and see Artemisia's famed warships. Artemisia sent servants to show Xena to her quarters, where she could bathe and borrow royal robes to dine. Once she was refreshed, Xena joined the queen at a sumptuous feast, where servants brought delicacies that had clearly come from all over in the eastern Mediterranean. As they ate, they shared stories of battles they had fought and enemies they had fought and enemies they had defeated. Xena was thrilled to be in the company of another warrior woman. Suddenly their pleasant dinner was interrupted by loud voices coming from the courtyard. As the door slammed open, both Xena and Artemisia were on their feet with swords drawn. They moved so quickly that even the royal guards were taken by surprise. A man dressed as royalty burst in, surrounded by his own guard. Upon recognizing the intruder, Artemisia relaxed and laughed. Cyaxares, What are you doing, bursting into my home uninvited? Just because you are king in your own land of Kalindia does not mean you are welcome here. Xena saw the hate in the man's eyes and kept a firm grip on her sword, on her own sword. I've come to demand that you marry me, said Cyaxares. I'm tired of waiting for you to choose from among your suitors. I am the strongest, and when we combine our kingdoms, we will rival even great King Xerxes himself in wealth and power. Never, said Artemisia. When I decide to marry, it is because I choose my husband, and I can assure you I will never choose you. Don't ever presume to enter my presence uninvited again, or I won't be so patient. Her eyes had grown as hard as Cyaxares's, and the queen had made a secret signal which caused a heavily armed force to enter silently and surround the king and his men. Cyaxares reconsidered his position, and he too let out a cold laugh. I was only kidding, Artemisia. Of course, I know you are queen in your own land. I am really here with a message from Xerxes. Let me join you and your warrior friend with a cup of wine, and I'll tell you the exciting news. Artemisia allowed Cyaxares to sit down with them, but Xena kept her sword close at hand and her wit steady. She took no more wine and drank only fragrant, rose scented lemonade. What is your news, Cyaxares? Asked the queen. He replied, Xerxes has lost patience with the Greeks. His mother, Atossa, has finally persuaded him to invade the Greek mainland and conquer the city-states that had so arrogantly interfered in the revolt of your own city, Miletus. Cyaxares spoke with the excitement of a man who sees the chance of plunder. The best news is that the fleet will sail in the Aegean to support Xerxes' land forces as they cross the Hellespont and invade Athens. Xerxes wants you to bring 5 of your ships, and I will join the Persian forces with 3 of mine. Now is our chance to prove once and for all that we are masters of the sea and that Athens' fledgling navy cannot withstand us. Artemisia's eyes shone as they imagined the impending battle, and the queen poured a large cup of wine for Cyaxares as they toasted the upcoming fight. I will even share secret news with you as a mark of my goodwill, said the king. I have been contacted by a Greek trader who wishes to defect and seek his fortune within the Persian Empire. He tells me he brings a gift of great value to Xerxes, and if I will gain him an audience, he will help me in the battle. He commands a warship and will send me a message if we engage and throw his support to me. This should again this should gain us additional advantage when the battle comes. Artemisia laughed scornfully. You can depend on traitors, but I count on my own wits and strength in the battle. We'll see who ends up better off. And she ordered more wine and cakes. Xena had some conflicting emotions. She could feel the excitement rise within her, what she always felt before a battle. She loved the anticipation that caused her muscles to tense and her brain to clear. However, she was not certain about this fight. She had many good relations with the Greeks. It was not eager to offend their gods and goddesses who had always shown her favor. She could imagine armed Athena rising to join the Greeks against her. Later, when she and Artemisia were again alone, she expressed another reservation. If I were going into battle on land, I would not want that snake, Cyaxares, guarding my flank. Is it also important to trust your companions in naval engagements? Yes, said Artemisia. I know that Cyaxares would be very happy if I died in the battle, because then he could try to take my kingdom. With me alive, he knows he cannot. I will not marry him, and I can easily defend my lands from him. But I can watch my own flank. And with you at my side, we will be victorious tomorrow. Victorious. Tomorrow we'll get the ships ready and see the messages from Xerxes that will give us our assignment. You will learn navy warfare in the best possible way by joining me in battle. The next morning the women once more donned their battle armor, and Xena accompanied Artemisia to the harbor. The warrior princess was amazed by what she saw. These were huge warships, the likes of which she had never seen. What kind of ships are these? Asked Xena in surprise. They are triremes, triremes, answered Artemisia, the latest ships of war. Each has 3 banks of oars on each side, with the oarsmen rowing on 3 different levels. It takes 27 oarsmen on each side at each level to move the giant ships. I can see the ports through which the oars will fit on 2 levels, said Xena. But how can yet more oarsmen fit at the top? Do you see that extension out from the deck? The top oarsmen fit their oars onto that outrigger, and they can thus row skillfully without tangling the oars with the men sitting below. The 170 oarsmen can move the trireme with great speed through the water. In addition, the trireme will take 30 more on board, 10 soldiers to fight off any who would try to board, 4 archers to attack the opposing soldiers, and 15 deckhands to help where needed. Finally, the ships carry the 2 most important people, a flautist who pipes time for the rowers, and a trierarch, the ship's commander, who steers at the helm. Only 10 soldiers and 4 archers? Exclaimed Xena incredulously. How can any commander hope to win a battle with so few soldiers? Artemisia laughed. Ships are no longer used simply to move soldiers from one place to another. They are weapons in themselves. Look at the bow of this magnificent trireme. Xena walked to the front of the sleek vessel and saw that the bow extended far out just below the waterline, and it was covered with bronze plates so that it was a huge spear that could be driven home by the force of the oarsmen rowing. Xena gazed into the painted eyes of the ship that were just above the ram, eyes to guide the warship in its fearful purpose. with the ships themselves as weapons, explained Artemisia. Practiced oarsmen, and most important, a skilled helmsman, can ram and sink any other ship on the water. Our triremes allow us to control both the seas and all the important ports. And the all important ports. Our spies tell us that the Athenians have just built a fleet of triremes, but our Phoenician trained oarsmen will outmaneuver the Greeks, and there is not a better admiral on the sea than I. Xena looked again at the eyes painted on the warship and thought of the 200 men who would be spilled into the sea as the pointed ram penetrated the wooden walls of the opposing trireme. It seemed as if the eyes are those of the sea monsters that lived in the Mediterranean to prey on humans. They seemed to glint in anticipation of the coming battle that would send corpses into the sea. While Xena explored the ships in the harbor, Artemisia went to receive her orders. That evening they sat together again and planned the upcoming campaign. Xerxes is bringing over 800 ships to support his land campaign. Artemisia said, "We are to guard the merchant ships that will supply his army and make sure the Athenian fleet stays out of the war. Xerxes will surely defeat the Greeks in this campaign, and then there will be no more threat of Greek revolts in our lands. We leave in 3 days. You will ride on my ship, and this battle will complete your education in naval warfare." That night, Xena's dreams troubled her and showed how torn she was about the upcoming battle. She did not want to help Xerxes' forces defeat the Greeks, who had always been her friends. She did not want to offend the Greek gods, who had shown her favor on her, but she did not want to miss what would be the most exciting naval battle the world had ever known. Finally, just before dawn, she had a dream that was the most vivid of all. In it, I appeared with the goddess Athena as vividly as if we were real. "Gabrielle, what are you doing here?" asked Xena in her dream. "What do you want me to do?" "I come with Athena to tell you to sail with Artemisia. The goddess has a task for you that you can only fulfill from Artemisia's trireme." "What is it?" Xena asked Xena. But the dream spirits did not answer. They faded away into the soft pre-dawn light. But Xena awoke from the dream refreshed and strong of purpose. She didn't know what awaited her, but she knew it was her destiny to sail with Artemisia and Xerxes' forces. Xerxes' land army had great success at the beginning of the engagement. His engineers had built a great pontoon bridge across the Hellespont where Xena had swum, and the whole army crossed without even getting their sandals wet. They defeated the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. although not easily, I must confess. They found a Greek shepherd to betray the Spartans, who so nobly stood against even the immortals, the elite Persian guard, with the pass taken. Xerxes' army swept down the Greek peninsula. Athens was in its path. The frightened Athenians sent to the Delphic oracle to ask what they should do, and as usual, the oracle gave a reply in the form of an ambiguous riddle. Take refuge behind a wooden wall that shall help thee and thy children. Some Athenians took this quite literally and built a wooden palisade on top of the Acropolis where they awaited the Persians. However, the Athenian leader Themistocles gave a different interpretation to the oracle's advice. He said the wooden walls were Athens' new wooden ships, and most of the Athenians evacuated the city to an island, Salamis, just off the coast of Attica. Salamis lay just at the head of the Bay of Eleusis, with narrow channels on the eastern and western ends of the island that led into the bay. The straits were no more than a couple of miles wide, not suitable for a pitched battle with hundreds of triremes. The Persians swept into Athens, and after a fierce battle burned the temples and the palisade on top of the Acropolis. Citizens on Salamis could see the smoke rise from their beloved city as the Persians looted anything that was left there. The great fleet was beached on the east side of the island of Salamis, and now it was left to the Persian navy to finish off the victory. Xerxes called his generals and admirals together to decide the best course of action. The Athenian leader, Themistocles, wanted to lure the Persians into a trap in the narrow straits. So he sent a slave pretending to be a spy to tell Xerxes that the Greek fleet was going to escape out of these straits to flee their trap at Salamis. Xerxes wanted to strike right away to defeat the fleet and seal his victory before the weather turned difficult. It was already September, and the fleet could not sail in the winter. Artemisia stood up in the council. Do not sail into the straits, great king. It is surely a trap, for the speed, maneuverability, and greater strength of our navy will be lost in the Straits of Salamis. Just as a few Spartans could hold off the immortals in the pass of Thermopylae, do not give the Athenians the same chance to trap the navy. Sir Axarus shouted down Artemisia. Do not listen to this weak woman. Leave it to the men in your navy to win this battle for you. If Artemisia does not have the heart for Greek blood, leave her here on shore to wait on your majesty while I lead my ships into the straits and destroy the Athenian navy. Faced with the pressure of the upcoming winter weather, Xerxes decided to risk all on the attack on the Greek fleet at Salamis. Against her better judgment, Artemisia joined the fleet. She could not resist taking her ships in against the best that the Greeks could throw at her. Just before dusk, the Persians moved 200 ships to block the western channel near Salamis. The Greek fleet would not be able to escape that way. Then at midnight, the rest of the fleet, over 300 triremes, including Artemisia's and Cyaxares', lined up at the head of the eastern straits. Xerxes himself had set up a golden throne on a hill overlooking the water, from where he could watch the battle. Just before dawn, the Greeks dragged their galleys down to the water, boarded, ran out their oars, and waited for the signal. At dawn, the dramatic movements began. The Greek trumpeters sounded, and the flutes on all the triremes, Greek and Persian, struck up their tunes. To the rhythm of the flutes, men pulled at their oars, and the galleys began to move out into the channel. As the two fleets closed, the Greeks in the center of the line backed water with their oars, so the center collapsed. Seeing the Greeks backing up, some Persian admirals were convinced they were fleeing and shouting their war cries. They charged into the breach, but the Persians did not know the local seas as did the Greeks, and they were lured into a trap. A great swell of water that periodically flowed from the channel caught some of the Persian ships from behind. Some were blocked out of line, and others were turned broadside to be exposed to the killing thrust of the Greek rams. The famed mobility of the Persian sailors was of no use in the narrow straits. The ships collided with each other, and as Persian ships sank, the confusion only increased. But Gabrielle, where were Artemisia and Xena and Nate broke in eagerly. Where were they in the straits? Were they in danger? Of course they were, Gabrielle answered. Artemisia placed her ships on the right flank of the line, as far away as possible from Cyaxares, whose ships were on the left, where he had been told he could meet the Greek traitor. Thus neither were drawn into the trap in the center and escaped the immediate danger. However, both were left with the new danger of how to escape from the straits as the victorious Greeks began to chase and surround remaining Persian vessels. Now, hush, child, while I tell you how Xena's and Artemisia's skill in war helped them fulfill Athena's purpose. As Artemisia led her ships in the right flank of the line, there was not enough room to turn to have the mighty bow strike the Greek ships that were rapidly approaching. Then Xena saw the skill of the admiral. As Artemisia came close to a Greek ship, she let out a shout, and the oarsmen on the right side quickly pulled in their oars as the trireme sped so close to the Greek ship that the side of Artemisia's trireme sheared off the oars on one side of the opposing vessel. The Greek ship was crippled, and Xena and the archers could pick off opposing Greeks. Now Artemisia had room to turn, for it was past time to get out of the straits while they still could. As they rowed out, two fleet Greek ships chased them and were gaining on them. Artemisia urged her men to row more quickly, but then she saw a ship blocking their way. It was Cyaxares. He had turned his ship slightly so that he blocked their way while he was waiting for the Greek ships to catch them and destroy them. Xena and Artemisia saw him standing at the helm, slowing his ship, and they saw the evil smirk on his face as he believed he had succeeded in trapping Artemisia. The Queen of Caria slowed her ship, looking around for an escape. Xena felt the rage of the warrior rise in her. This was the rage that drove the Viking berserkers to fight blindly and the rage that led Hercules to his heroics. She saw Cyaxares' ship through a blood-red haze, but her mind was icy clear. "Artemisia," she shouted, "speed up and ram him." "I can't, Xena," said the queen. "Xerxes is watching and will kill me for treason if I make it out of here." "Don't argue," Xena roared, with her teeth bared in the look of the wolf. "Ram him now." The two warrior women stood at the helm as the flautist sped up the cadence. Artemisia's ship sped through the water directly at Cyaxares. Too late he saw their purpose and tried to turn his trireme to speed away. They had the momentum and the bronze tip smashed into the trireme, accompanied by the sounds of splintered wood and screams of oarsmen who felt the bite of the bronze in their flesh. The ship sank rapidly, and Artemisia's ship swept over the drowning men as it continued its way out of the straits. This bold act brought some immediate benefits to Artemisia and her warrior companion. First, the captain of the Greek ship that was chasing them assumed Artemisia was helping the Greeks, so he veered off to turn his attention to other Persian vessels. Remarkably, Xerxes' counselors, who were watching the battle that was rapidly turning into a rout, misunderstood the action. One advisor remarked to Xerxes as the king sat on his golden throne placed on the high cliff overlooking the straits, "Master, do you see Artemisia? How well she fights!" "Lo, she has sunk a vessel of the enemy," Xerxes replied. "Are you sure the valiant ship is really that of Artemisia?" "Yes," replied the counselor. "I recognize her standard on the prow." The king of the Chaldeans had lost his standard early in the engagement, so Xerxes could not recognize the ship and simply assumed it was Greek. It seemed that Artemisia would break free of the trap unscathed, but there remained one more Greek ship blocking their way, the ship of a Greek traitor, Crichton, who had conspired with Cyaxares to betray the Greeks and defect to the Persians. He had kept his ship back with the Chaldean vessels away from the heart of the fighting, with the victory clearly going to the Greeks. Crichton had not yet decided what to do. He stood on deck and watched as Artemisia's ship approached. Should he attack her ship and restore his reputation with the Greeks, or should he turn and continue to seek his fortune? with the great King Xerxes. He had his gift for Xerxes with him, his beautiful 2-year-old daughter, with hair like the sun and eyes the color of the sea. She was as lovely as Aphrodite herself, and Crichton planned to give the child to Xerxes. She would be raised in the harem and trained in the arts of love. Then, when she was 12, she would be given to the king as a concubine to please him in his old age. That's me, interrupted a knight. Why would my father have planned such a cruel fate for me? The girl looked crestfallen as her eyes lost the excited fire they had when Gabrielle told of the battle. She once again resembled the hurt, haunted child whom Xena had brought to Gabrielle so many years before. I'm sorry, child, the bard said gently. Know that there are evil people in the world who care more for power and wealth than they do for the helpless ones in their charge. There is no crime greater than to betray that trust. But remember, you are beloved of Athena. It was she who sent Xena to save you. Now let me continue the tale. Try to forget the evil as you hear how the way of the warrior brought your salvation. Xena saw you, a frightened child, on the deck, and the rage rose up in her again. In the sun that shone brightly on the carnage of the battle, Xena saw a vision of Athena smiling, and the warrior princess knew this was why she was here. I will save the child. Artemisia, pull your ship close and shear the Greek ship's oars off. When it is disabled, I will board, and as soon as I am clear with the girl, ram the ship of that traitor and escape back to Xerxes. That the skilled admiral didn't hesitate, and she drew her ship close to attack. Before Crichton knew what was happening, Artemisia had drawn close, ordered her oars pulled in, and disabled his vessel. As Crichton shrieked with rage, Xena leaped on board. With swords, with sword and boots, Xena quickly dispatched the foot soldiers and archers who guarded the deck, and she kicked many overboard while slashing the others. Then she approached the helm, where Crichton had grabbed you and held a knife to your neck. If you want this child to live, you are immediately leave my ship and tell Artemisia to pull away. Otherwise, I will kill her now and swim away from this place. Crichton shouted. He cut your neck, drawing blood to prove his resolve, and Neat fingered the scar she still bore as she listened to Gabrielle's account. Xena neither answered nor hesitated, but faster than the eye could see, flung her chakram at the hand that held the knife. The razor-sharp circle spun through the air and cut Crichton's hand, forcing him to drop the killing blade. As the lethal circlet ricocheted off the mast and returned to Xena, Crichton screamed in pain and rage. You still will not have her. Poseidon or the sea monsters can claim this child. With these brutal words, Crichton used his good arm to fling it into the sea on the far side of the ship. You had hardly begun to sink below the waves in the powerful current of the straits when Xena dove into the water and swept you into her strong arms. She surfaced and swung you around to her back and told you to hold tightly to her neck. You didn't need to be told twice, and you held on with strength remarkable in so small a child. Xena began to swim, stroking strongly, to the Greek mainland, where Xerxes' forces guarded the great king on his golden throne. As Xena swam, she heard the sickening crash of a bronze bow striking Crichton's wooden ship. Artemisia had struck true, and Xerxes witnessed her prowess again. Herodotus, Herodotus, the Greek historian who preserved the details of this battle, recorded Xerxes' words as he watched most of his ships sink, and Artemisia vigorously escaped the trap. My men have become weak as women, and my women strong as men. Both Artemisia and Xena would have laughed at his pointless comparison, but they didn't hear it as they were too busy finishing this day's work. Xena brought you on shore safely and was letting you rest a moment before moving on. She did not intend to return to Xerxes' court, but instead take you straight north up the Greek peninsula to bring you home to me. But she took a moment to look back at the carnage of the Battle of Salamis. The fight, which had begun at dawn, had lasted for 8 hours. The Persians lost more than 200 ships, while the Greeks lost only 40. The surviving Persian ships fled and never again engaged the Greeks at sea. Athens had proved itself to be the master of the eastern Mediterranean. As Xena looked at the bodies of men and the wrecks of mighty triremes, her mind was lost in reflections on the battle. Suddenly a hand grabbed her ankle, pulled her down. It was Cyaxares. He, too, had swum from the wreckage of his ship to the shore near Xerxes. He had been resting behind a rock when Xena brought you ashore, and now he pulled Xena down and reached his hand around her neck. "I'll get even with you right now," he growled, "and I'll take this little blonde gift to Xerxes myself. Once I tell him how Artemisia ran my ship, she will die horribly, and I'll have her lands. She should not have challenged me." His hands closed tightly around Xena's throat, cutting off her air. Even as her eyes began to dim, the rage of battle rose in her once more. With superhuman determination, she reached for her breastplate and drew the dagger she kept hidden there. With her last ounce of strength, she drove it deeply under Cyaxares' ribs to his heart. She grinned as she heard his death rattle and felt his hands loosen on her throat. "Here's my last gift to you, Artemisia," Xena thought, as she shoved the body off to the side. The Greek historian Herodotus would write that no one from the Calindian ship survived the tale of Artemisia's act, as she continued as Xerxes' favorite admiral. Indeed, when Xerxes needed someone to take his children back to his own lands in Asia Minor, the great king entrusted them to the queen of Caria, who had proven herself that day to be the greatest captain of the Persian fleet. Xena's trip home with you was uneventful, and you have been with us ever since, growing stronger and wiser every day. Anit sighed with satisfaction as the spell of the story faded, and the fog once more shrouded the woods around the campfire. "I'm going to follow the way of the warrior just like Xena," she said energetically. Gabrielle laughed and said, "But remember, without the way of the bard to preserve the stories, the ways of the warriors will be no more than forgotten fights." Ooh. The next chapter, A Weapon of Flesh and Bone. Tim Wagner and Russell Davis. Xena paused in her long walk and took a sip from her dwindling water supply. The sun beat down on the dead landscape, searing the already tilled and broken ground. She saw no living vegetation, and the only evidence that there ever had been any was the occasional leafless tree desperately clinging to the dry soil. She had not seen any sign of water in this place since Athena, goddess of wisdom and battle, had banished her here. Xena removed the wide leather thong that was holding her long, dark hair in place. It was damp with her sweet sweat, and she quickly pulled her hair back into place and retired it. She had traveled across the length and breadth of the known world, as well as the not so known world, and she was no stranger to deserts. This one seemed almost familiar, as if she'd been here before. But then all deserts were alike: hot, humid, numblingly boring, and unless you were well prepared, and thanks to Athena, she was not deadly. At the farthest edge of the horizon, she could make out a variation in the landscape. A hill, maybe a tall building. Distance was deceptive in this heat, and there was no telling what it was. Still, it was a destination of sorts, and it wasn't as if she had anywhere else to go. She started walking toward the whatever it was, mindful of the fact that she had no armor and no weapons, and that if she met anyone hostile, she'd be in deep trouble. "Damn you anyway, Athena," she muttered and adjusted the straps of her backpack. 3 days ago, or was it 4? Athena had come to her in a dream. "Xena," the goddess said, "you are a warrior princess, and of that there is no doubt. But what my brother Ares has failed to impress upon you is that being a warrior is not about the sword or your precious chakram, but about using your mind. You've been clever, but only at the last moment, when there was no other choice. And there's a difference between cleverness and wisdom. I intend to teach you the latter." "Why?" Xena asked. "Simple," replied Athena. "Because your arrogance displeases me, and your suffering at my hands will certainly annoy my brother Ares." The goddess chuckled. "With wisdom comes humility, or death. Which do you think you will find, Xena?" "I don't fear you, Athena," Xena shouted. "I have faced the challenges of the gods before, and lived to tell the tale." "That was then, warrior princess," Athena said. "This is now. When you awaken, this dream will be over, but your nightmare will have only begun." Xena had awoken to a nightmare, all right. Gabrielle was gone, so were all of her weapons and belongings. Instead of armor, she found herself garbed in a simple gray tunic, the sort of outfit a servant might wear. On the sun-blasted ground next to her was a pack containing 3 skins of water and enough dried meat for only a few spare meals. She had eaten the last of the food yesterday, and she had only half a skin of water left. Whatever was in the distance, Xena hoped to find food and water, especially water, there. It would be awfully hard to learn wisdom after dying of thirst. As the sun continued pounding down on her, Xena contemplated calling upon Ares, but she knew that would be hopeless. The war god despised weakness of any kind, and most likely he would be unable to help her here in whatever hellish place Athena had sent her. Besides, she thought to herself, I think Athena's wrong. I don't always reach for my sword when there's trouble. Still, she knew she had no choice but to continue to play the goddess game. So she trudged onward, one aching step after another, trying desperately and without much success not to think about cool, clear, life sustaining water. The punishing sun had finally edged toward the horizon when Xena realized she wasn't alone on the desert landscape. Off to the west, she could just make out the form of a rider on horseback. Was the rider male? Female? It was impossible to tell from this distance. Though she was incredibly thirsty, Xena was still a warrior, and long practice caution won out over thirst. How's that for using my head, Athena? She thought. The goddess didn't respond. Not that Xena had expected her to. Xena scanned the desert all around her, checking to make certain the rider didn't have any friends with less than noble intentions who might be approaching from a different direction. Saying no one else, she began heading toward the stranger. The rider wisely kept the horse to a walk. Ride a mount any faster in this heat, and you'd soon be serving up a meal of horseflesh for the vultures. Xena judged she had crossed half the distance to the rider, who was moving at an angle northeastward to her. When the stranger reined the horse to a stop, she'd been noticed. Xena halted to give the rider a chance to look her over, decided if she was a threat. It would be the rider's choice whether to make contact or not. If the rider elected to move off, Xena could hardly run the stranger down on foot, certainly not as weak as she was. The rider sat motionless for several long moments, a blurry figure obscured by a curtain of shimmering heat, watching. Finally, the rider tapped heels to horse flanks and began moving toward Xena at a slow trot. She could have merely waited for the stranger to arrive, let the horse do the work for both of them. But she resumed walking. As the rider drew near, Xena stopped and stared. The stranger was a young woman, in her early 20s, if that. She had straight black hair and, while not unattractive, had a hard face, as if she were formed of marble instead of flesh. Her eyes were clear and as coldly penetrating as those of a hawk. It was herself, Xena, as she had been not long after being ostracized from her home village of Amphipolis. The girl was somewhat slimmer of face and limb, of course, and her flesh bore fewer scars than that of her older self. But it was her, garbed as a desert tribeswoman, in a white robe and cloth headpiece for protection against the heat. However, Xena knew that beneath the robe the girl wore cheap leather armor, and at her side a sword that was only slightly more expensive. The rider brought her mount close to Xena, but not within arm's reach, and stopped. "Are you a pilgrim or a fool?" the girl asked in a voice hard as flint. Xena blinked. "Pardon me? You must be one or the other. No one else would risk crossing the desert on foot. My guess is you're a fool." Xena had to keep from smiling. It was just the sort of thing she would have said at that age. "Oh, and why is that?" "Your pack isn't very large. I doubt it contains more than 3 water skins. Hardly enough for this heat." The horses' saddlebags bulged, and Xena knew they were crammed full of water skins, a supply for both rider and mount. She imagined she could smell the water within the bags, and she had to fight this urge to take a step forward. Xena knew there was any number of explanations for her younger self's presence. Perhaps she was simply a hallucination brought about by the heat, or if she was real, perhaps her true appearance was masked by sorcery, or maybe Xena faced some manner of shape-changing demon. She'd seen and killed far stranger things in her time, but none of those explanations felt right. Her instincts told her that this woman was exactly what she appeared to be, Xena's younger self. But how? Time as you know it is meaningless to the gods. Athena's voice whispered in her mind. Time is a river, and mortals are like fish. I merely plucked you out of the river at one point, your present, then walked along the back upstream and dropped you back in at a different point, your past. Nothing to it, really, with a bit of help from my cousin, Kronos, that is. So it was true. This young woman was Xena, during a time in her life when she was still learning the way of the warrior, but before she had begun to travel down the dark path of blood and conquest. If she could only tell her younger self of the evil that lay ahead of her, perhaps she would be able to avoid. "You walk the path the gods ordained for you, Xena," Athena mind whispered. "You are not here to change it." "No," Xena thought back. "I'm here to learn the difference between cleverness and wisdom. And I suppose you've brought me face to face with my younger self because she's even less prone to thinking before acting than I am. An awfully elaborate lesson, shouldn't you say, Athena?" Athena didn't reply, but Xena had the impression that the goddess, wherever she was smiling. "Has the sun addled your brains, old woman?" Young Xena sneered. "Addled? Old? You just stand there looking at me like you've lost what few wits you had to begin with." Xena bristled. She'd never been one for social niceties, but she didn't recall ever being this obnoxious. She opened her mouth, prepared to give her younger self a rather large piece of her mind. But then she thought better of it. After all, she was the more mature, not old, of the two, and therefore she should act like it. I beg your pardon? Xena said, I'm afraid the trials of the last few days have indeed taken their toll on me. I was a member of a merchant caravan that was beset by desert raiders. The bandits killed everyone, looted our wagons, and then set them aflame before riding off. I alone survived. By the grace of the gods, the thieves took all our weapons and most of our supplies. Luckily, they missed a bit of water and food. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me alive for the last several days. Not bad for improvising, Xena thought. The young Xena frowned. You survived an attack by bandits without a mark on you? Xena thought fast. I was struck on the head during the initial attack. The raiders assumed I was dead and left me while they fell on my companions. Young Xena's frown deepened into a scowl, and Xena thought her younger self wasn't going to buy her story, but finally she snorted and said, Fools. They should have cut everyone's throat before leaving to make sure there were no survivors. Despite the oppressive heat, Xena felt a chill slide along her spine at the casual cold-bloodedness of her counterpart's words. Young Xena reached into one of her saddlebags and brought forth a skin of water. Here, she tossed the skin to Xena, who caught it easily. Xena pried loose the stopper and drank, forcing herself to go slowly, although she desperately wanted to drain the entire skin. She knew better. Conservation of water was key to survival in the desert. Plus, it would be rude to take it all. She finished, replaced the stopper, and held the skin out to her younger self. My thanks. Keep it, I have more. Xena nodded. My thanks again. She put the skin in her pack. My name is Xena, her counterpart said. I'm a traveler. Xena smiled. This seems a strange place for sightseeing. I'm curious as to what lands lie on the other side of the desert. Xena knew this was a lie. She understood now why this desert had seemed familiar to her before. It was because she had traveled it during her youth, seeking a legendary tribe, a desert folk, who were reputed to possess the power to make themselves invisible during battle. She had eventually found the tribe, only to discover their abilities had been greatly exaggerated. While they could not render themselves unseen, they could move like striking serpents when they fought, nearly faster than the human eye could follow. She had stayed and studied with them for a time, and had learned much. And who are you? Her counterpart asked. Xena couldn't very well give her true name. It wasn't that her younger self would suspect the truth. This Xena, while not completely inexperienced, would have had only a few encounters with magic so far and was largely unaware of how truly strange and wondrous existence could be. No, it would be merely awkward to name herself Xena, and it might raise questions that she'd prefer not to answer. So she gave the first name that came to her, Gabrielle. Young Xena's lips twitched into a sneer. A silly name, she muttered. Gabrielle shrugged. It served me well enough over the years. A silence fell between them, when that young Xena finally broke by gesturing toward the object on distant horizon. I take it you were heading there? Yes, though I'm not sure exactly where there is. A place to be avoided, or so I've been told in the villages where I've stopped to refill my water skins. People say it's a temple of some sort, dedicated to some manner of evil god. She sniffed. Not that I put much stock in ghost stories. Xena remembered now. She had originally avoided the temple not out of fear, though despite her younger counterpart's words, Xena knew that was part of the reason, but because she had been so intent on fighting the warrior tribe and learning from them all that she could. She had a tendency to be somewhat obsessive in her younger days. Thankfully, she had matured since then. Don't say anything, Athena. The goddess chuckle drifted through her mind. You can come with me if you wish, young Xena said. I can drop you off at the next village we come to. Her lips drew back from her teeth in a gesture too cold to be called a smile. Or we could seek out the raiders who attacked your caravan and take vengeance for your fallen comrades. Whichever you choose, you're going to need to be armed. Young Xena reached into a robe and drew forth a dagger with a cat-like flick of her wrist. She hurled the blade hilt first toward her older self. Xena started to reach up to catch the dagger, but her hand froze and the hilt thunked painfully into her shoulder. The knife fell to the sand. Young Xena smirked. Sorry, she said, sounding anything but. Xena scowled, but didn't reply. The last 3 days had taken their toll. That was all. She was still just as fast as she ever was. She wasn't getting slow, getting old. She wasn't. She bent down to retrieve the dagger, but as she reached for it, her hand froze once more. No weapons, warrior princess, Athena Mind spoke. I sent you with none, and you will be unable to wield any as long as you remain in the past. Xena concentrated, bending all of her will to overcoming the enchantment, but it was no use. She couldn't move her hand so much as another inch toward the blade. She straightened and faced her younger self. I thank you for your offer, but I practice a philosophy of, she gritted her teeth, nonviolence. I cannot accept the vet dagger. Young Xena looked at her as if she were mad, but all she said was, can you at least return it to me then? She held out her hand. Xena wasn't certain whether she could or not. She bent down, reached for the blade, and this time she was able to close her fingers around the hilt. She stepped closer to her younger self and returned the dagger. Xena didn't even try to hold onto the knife, for she knew she wouldn't be able to. Young Xena tucked the blade back into her robe. So are you going to ride with me or not? Xena considered. She couldn't very well continue walking through the desert on her own. Before long she was sure to perish, and she harbored no illusions that Athena would step in and save her at the last moment. The gods played for keeps. On the other hand, she wasn't sure that continuing to have contact with her younger self was a good idea either. She didn't know whether she was capable of changing her own past. After all, she had no memories of meeting a Gabrielle when she originally crossed this desert. But there was always the possibility. Why else would Athena have forbidden her from attempting to warn her younger self of the dark path that lay before her unless the past could be changed? By continuing to have contact with her counterpart, Xena might well alter the course of her life in some unknown disastrous fashion. She might end up getting her younger self killed. No, best to leave things as they are. The course of Xena's life had been far from perfect, very far, but it was her life, and for better or worse, she would play out the hand she had been dealt. Again, my thanks, but I believe I will continue on toward the temple. She smiled. Like you, I place little stock in ghost stories. Perhaps there I will be able to rest and regain my strength before I attempt to return home. And if it really was a place of evil, then it was most likely the challenge Athena had sent her here to deal with. Young Xena shrugged. Suit yourself. She held out a hand. Xena frowned. I don't understand. I told you. I wish to go to the temple, and I heard you. I'll drop you off before continuing on my way. Xena definitely remembered bypassing the temple when she had sat in her counterpart's saddle. She had to make sure that her other half self continued onward without stopping at the temple. If she wished to avoid changing her past too dramatically, there is no need, it is not far. Young Xena scowled. All the more reason for you to let me give you a ride. Thinking quickly, Xena replied, my philosophy of nonviolence does not permit me to allow any sort of harm to come to another. As I said, I do not believe the temple is haunted, but if it is, I cannot risk my any ill befalling you because you chose to aid me. Young Xena smirked. I can take care of myself, old woman. Xena ground her teeth. This little snip was damn lucky Athena had taken away her weapons, along with her ability to use them. She'd have liked to take the flat of a sword right to her younger self's posterior right then. Of that I have no doubt. But I would rather continue on to the temple alone. My thanks for the water, and good luck on your journey. She turned in the direction of the temple and began walking, hoping that her younger self would become exasperated and ride off. You know what I think? Young Xena called out after her. I think there's another reason you don't want me to go to the temple. A reason that has nothing to do with your supposed philosophy. Xena kept walking. I think you know more about the temple than you're letting on. The rumors of evil are just lies designed to scare people off, to keep them from finding out what the temple truly contains. Uh-oh, Xena thought. What is it? Gold, diamonds, rubies? Young Xena's voice was thick with avarice. Avarice. Xena had forgotten that twin missions drove her younger self in order to protect her homeland. She intended to become a great warrior, the greatest the world had ever seen, and raise an army to follow her. Becoming a great warrior meant learning all that she could about the martial arts, hence her reason for seeking out the desert tribe. But building an army took riches, and Xena had constantly been on the lookout for ways to obtain the money she would need to build a proper fighting force. Xena stopped walking and turned to face her young counterpart. No, that's not it at all. Hiya! The other Xena dug her heels into her horse's sides and snapped the reins. The mount surged forward in response, its hooves sending up showers of sand. Wait, don't! Xena shouted as her younger self flew past grinning, but the young warrior continued to pick up speed as she drove her horse on toward the temple. Damn it, Xena swore and began walking as fast as she dared. As she continued on her way, she couldn't help thinking that both of them were doing exactly what Athena wanted them to. The sun had set and an almost full moon had risen before Xena reached the temple. A chest-high wall of gray stone surrounded the building, and the main entrance was nothing more than two wind-scoured marble pillars, broken hinges, the only remains of gates long since gone. Xena stopped before the entrance and listened for sounds of life, but heard only sand blowing against the walls. St- Stepping quietly into the courtyard, she felt unseen eyes trained upon her, but the moonlight revealed only the muted stones of the temple, sand drifts, and the abandoned horse of her younger self. No doubt she's gone inside to look for hidden treasure, Xena thought. In the center of the courtyard, a well and drop bucket beckoned, and Xena crossed to it as quickly as her aching, weakened legs would allow, if she had any hope of facing whatever challenge Athena had placed before her, not to mention extricating her younger self from whatever trouble she had surely found. Xena needed water, and she needed it now. With trembling hands, she lowered the bucket into the well, and after a considerable descent, she heard it splash down. Thanks, Ares, she thought as she slowly began to pull the full bucket upward. I've got a fighting chance now. But before she could shake her thirst, the sands exploded as the swirling forms of the temple's scimitar wielding guards appeared all around her. She had been lying in wait, buried beneath the surface sand. An obvious trick, one she would have anticipated if she hadn't been mind weak with thirst. Xena released her grip on the bucket's rope and whirled to defend herself, even though she knew it was useless, for she was both weaponless and incapable of violence. Still, I've got to try. Letting forth an ululating war cry, Xena leapt forward, grasping at the helm of the closest guard, with the intent of swinging his body into the others. But her movements were slowed by the depredations she'd suffered during the course of the last several days, and he caught her as easily as he would a child. Grinning, the man violently twisted her arm around and shoved her to the ground. Spit and sand. Xena sat up and came face to face with several scimitars glinting cold and deadly in the moonlight. A voice from the temple patio called out, "Do not harm her! We can use her for the sacrifice." The words were not Greek, but rather spoken in a desert dialect that Xena had a small degree of familiarity with, though she was far from fluent. Xena was hoisted roughly to her feet, and she got her first good look at the speaker, garbed in the robes of a priest. Her captor was a tall man with a black, bedraggled beard and the blazing eyes of a fanatic. "Is this how you treat all your guests?" Xena asked haltingly, for it had been some years since she had spoken this language. "Silence, water stealer," he said, "or I will have my men cut out your tongue." Xena nodded, not particularly impressed by the threat. There had been a time when she might have said the same thing. Besides, she was too busy planning her escape to pay full attention to the priest's words. Escape, the man said, as if reading her mind, is impossible. He grinned at his men, pushed her forward. Besides, where would you go? You have no water. He's got a point, Xena thought wryly. Besides, she was certain this was where Athena wanted her to be. What is this place? She asked, ignoring the priest's threat. The Temple of Nao, he responded in the reverent tone of a true believer. A mighty water demon who came to this land centuries ago as the servant of a powerful but foolish wizard. One day the mage made the mistake of lowering his guard, and Nile destroyed him. The demon god then raised up this temple as a place of worship and sucked the waters from the soil. This land was once fertile, but it is now a desert for miles in all directions thanks to the all-powerful Nile. Let me guess, Xena said. You're the demon's high priest. That is correct. While I once had another name, I am known now only as the Aquifer, the bringer of water. I perform the sacred rites of Nile. Nile provides water. He gestured at the well, and the tribes for miles around do whatever you tell them to do. Tell them to, or they go thirsty, Xena finished. The priest smiled wildly. I see you have an excellent grasp of the finer points of theology, but Niall's blessing does not come without a price. Ordinarily, one of my guards would have offered his life to ensure the well remains filled for another month. But there's no need for that, not now. That you are here, a stranger and a water stealer to boot. Tonight your blood will quench Niall's thirst, and in return he shall quench ours. Big surprise, Xena muttered. If I had a gold coin for every two-bit priest who tried to sacrifice me to his almighty God. Aquifer glanced up at the moon. Enough talk, the time is nigh for the ceremony to begin. Come, your companion awaits you on the altar. Companion? Xena asked. Yes, Aquifer peered closely at Xena. She resembles you a great deal. Is she his sister, perhaps? In a matter of speaking, Xena thought. She shook her head. Perhaps she is from the same tribe, then. The priest shrugged. It doesn't matter. She arrived earlier, lusting for more than just water. She quickly discovered that my guards are more than capable of defending against looters as well as water thieves. Still, she fought well, killing several of my warriors before she was subdued. A pity to see so much blood spilled so wastefully. Xena couldn't help feeling a rush of vicarious satisfaction at her younger self's limited victory. At least one of them could still fight. It's time to enter the temple, Aquifer said. Out of respect for now, you must be silent from this point on. Or what? Xena asked. You'll kill me? The priest chuckled. Of course we're going to kill you, but if you're silent, we won't cut your tongue first. Xena nodded. Right, the tongue thing. Almost forgot. The guards escorted the warrior princess into the temple of Nao. Xena was laid on a stone altar next to her younger self. Both women were bound, strips of leather wrapped tightly around their wrists and ankles. biting painfully into the skin. Periodically, young Xena struggled against her bonds, but Xena that held her didn't bother. She knew escape didn't lie down that road. The chamber which she took to be Niall's sanctorium, sanctorum, sanctum sanctorum, wasn't particularly impressive. Dirt floor, stone walls, doomed ceiling, guttering torches for light. But the central feature of the chamber more than made up for the room's simplicity. In the middle of the floor was a pool with a radius of 15 feet. The water was the purest blue, the color so bright and rich that it almost seemed to glow with an inner light. The pool wasn't still, though. The water swirled around and round in a miniature maelstrom, which Aquifer called the gyre. Silently the water spun, and not a single drop was flung forth from the pool. The overall effect was quite eerie, which Xena supposed was the point. On the other side of the gear, the bodies of 5 guards, those slain by her younger counterpart, were laid out upon the floor, the heads nearest to the maelstrom's edge, feet pointing away from the water. The 2 of the remaining guards stood at the chamber's entrance, hands resting on the hilts of their scimitars, while 2 more took position near Aquifer. Whether these guards were supposed to protect the priest from his captors or from his god, Xena didn't know. Aquifer knelt before a gear, but not too closely, Xena noted, chanting a prayer in his desert language. The guards joined in, filling the chamber with reverent tones that held more than a hint of madness. "This is a fine mess you've gotten into, old woman," young Xena whispered. "I don't recall telling you to sneak into the temple and try to steal a demon's treasure." Despite her words, though, Xena felt guilty. Her younger self would not have ended up bound on Niall's altar if it hadn't been for her interference. Was it possible for the same person to die twice, in 2 different times, at 2 different ages? If Xena couldn't think of a way out of this situation, and fast, she was going to find out. Young, young Xena struggled against her bonds. "If I could just get loose, find my sword, it wouldn't make a difference. This isn't a problem that a sword can solve." She was about to say more, but then the prayer ended and Aquifer stood. He reached into his robe and brought forth a wicked-looking dagger with a gold hilt encrusted with blue diamonds. Diamonds the same color as the water that swirled in the gear. "The time has come." He stepped toward the altar and raised the blade. Ceremonial the dagger might be, but its edge looked sharp enough to cut through bone. "Think, damn you, Xena, think!" Rockefeller turned his head to shout toward the water. "Now! Water giver, life bringer, lord of the depths, and king of the waves, come forth to accept the gift of blood that I offer in your name." The priest's words echoed in Xena's mind. Gift of blood. From within the swirling waters of the gear, a long, sinuous shape stretched forth. At first, Xena thought it was a serpent of some kind, but there was no head, no eyes, no mouth. It was a tentacle, but one unlike many she had seen before. During the course of her wanderings, Xena had done her fair share of sailing, and she had seen octopi and squid, but this tentacle belonged to a far different creature. The skin was leathery, more like lizard hide than the flesh of a sea beast. Its color was a sickly whitish green, like something that had lain too long at the bottom of a foul dark sea. The appendage was covered with tiny puckered dimples, and it emitted a fetid odor of rotting flesh and vegetable matter. As the tentacle extended farther into the chamber, Rosina had at first taken as dimples opened to reveal tiny rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. The tentacle was covered with mouths, hundreds of them, and they all thirsted for the same thing, blood, that I offer in your name. And then it came to her, but she realized that the weapon wasn't one she could yield. Xena, she whispered harshly, offer the blood of the guards you killed to now. Young Xena's head snapped around to peer at her. Then she nodded in understanding. Now, she shouted, in your name I offer the blood of the 5 slain guards. Aquifer let out a shriek of surprise and anger. His eyes blazed with fury, and for an instant Xena thought he would plunge the diamond-encrusted dagger into her chest. But instead the priest turned away from the altar and began rapidly chanting to his god in an attempt to regain control. But it was too late. 4 other tentacles streaked forth from the gyre to join the first, and all 5 wrapped around the bodies of the dead guards. The mouths went to work, and within seconds the corpses had been drained completely of all fluid and had become dried, flattened husk. The priest screamed in fury. He turned and ran toward the altar, dagger raised high. Now, kill Aquifer and the remaining guards, young Xena shouted. A writhing tentacle shot out of the pool and wrapped itself around Aquifer's waist. He was pulled, shrieking into the swirling maelstrom. When they saw what happened to their priest, the guards tried to run, but they weren't fast enough. Moments later, the 2 Xenas were the only ones left in the chamber. Not a bad idea, young Xena said, for someone who doesn't believe in violence. Her older counterpart smiled and Let the comment pass. Thanks, she didn't know if her idea would work or not. One tentacle remained just above the surface of the swirling water, swaying back and forth slowly, like a trained snake, awaiting its master's next order. Xena looked at the smugly smiling version of herself and said, you probably ought to have him cut us loose. Young Xena nodded. Now, cut our bonds, she said. The tentacle withdrew into gyre momentarily, but then reappeared clutching the ceremonial dagger with surprised gentleness. Nile cut the leather thongs, freeing the 2 women. The tentacle then withdrew back to the pool, dropped the blade into the water, and resumed its waiting position above the surface. You were right, young Xena said. Now what? When you said this wasn't a problem a sword could solve, I guess steel isn't the answer to everything, eh? No, Xena said thoughtfully. I don't suppose it is. They got down from the altar and stood looking at the pool and at Niall's sole remaining tentacle. What's it waiting for? Young Xena asked. Xena shrugged. Another commando, suppose? A dangerous glint came into her younger counterpart's eyes. If I could command a beast like that, don't even think about it. You saw how easily it turned against Aquifer and his men. How long would it be before the demon turned on you, one way or another? Young Xena nodded, though she didn't look too happy about it. So how do we keep anyone else from coming along and taking Aquifer's place? Simple, tell him to destroy it, and then start running. Nio, young Xena commanded. Destroy this temple. A terrible inhuman shriek bubbled up from deep within the air, and hundreds of tentacles burst forth from the pool, questing for the very foundations for the ancient temple. Both of Xena's ran like hell. It took now several hours to reduce the temple to rubble. The two Xenas stood some distance from the temple wall and watched as most of the buildings disappeared into the swirling sands. When the tentacles finally reached the wall, they could see how each stone was literally shattered with water from within, as though each tentacle had the power to dissolve rock. It was an eerie sight, and both Xenas were silent. By the time the moon set, it was over. Well, the younger Xena said quietly, you don't see that every day. Xena smiled to herself, thinking how many times she'd say that over the years, when some strange thing or another had happened to her during her travels. No, she replied, I guess you don't. Now, what will you do next? What will you do? The younger Xena asked. Go home, Xena said. At least I hope so. Her younger self looked at the horizon and where the sun was just beginning to lighten the sky. It's almost daybreak, she said. Are you going to rest first? Well, the gods know I'm tired enough, Xena admitted. You could probably use a little rest yourself. Young Xena shrugged. Plenty of time for sleep when you're dead, she replied. I wonder when I changed my mind about that, Xena said to herself. So you'll be moving on? Yes, she said, and then added, you're no fighter, Gabrielle, but you're welcome to come with me, at least to the next village, if nothing else. You think clearly, which is more than I can say for most people I meet. Thanks, Xena said, for the compliment and the offer, but my path lies in a different direction than yours. Who knows, maybe we'll meet again someday. Maybe, said young Xena. She reached into her saddle bags and removed two water skins. Take these, she said. I wish it were more, but it's all I can spare. I don't know how long I'm going to be out here. Xena nodded, slipping the skins into her pack. Thank you again. Young Xena mounted her horse and looked down. It's the least I can do since it appears I owe you my life. That's not a debt I'll be forgetting, and one day maybe I'll have the chance to repay it. Xena smiled. I'm almost sure of it, she said. Good journey to you, Xena. And to you, Gabrielle, she replied. She touched her horse's flanks slightly and started into the desert. For a few moments, Xena watched her younger self ride away. Then she had a notion. Xena, she called. The horse stopped and her younger self looked back. What is it? You're going the wrong way, Xena said. The tribe you're looking for lives to the northeast. Young Xena turned the horse around and trotted back. What do you mean? Xena smiled at the younger version of herself. The warrior tribe you seek, their village lies in the northeast. You are headed west. How do you know what I seek? Xena asked. Only pilgrims and fools across this desert, and I already know you're no fool. And the only pilgrimage worth making out here is to the Lundio tribe, the invisible warriors. Young Xena scowled suspiciously. Who are you? She demanded. Definitely not a fool, Xena replied with a chuckle. Go on now. You should be there in a few days. And time is precious. Young Xena sat motionless for a moment, then turned her horse northeast. I've had enough strangers in one day to last me a lifetime. I don't know who you are, Gabrielle, if that is truly your name, but thanks for the tip. You're welcome. Good journey. Young Xena raised a hand in farewell, and Xena watched her ride off into the desert. When she was certain that her younger self wasn't going to return, she picked up her pack and carried it to a nearby rock, a leftover piece of the temple wall sticking up out of the sand. She lay down with her head on the pack, and as the sun crested the horizon, she slept, falling deep into a dream of Athena. The goddess was garbed in a white robe and olive leaves, adorned her brow in a wreath, but her left arm held a sturdy white shield, and in her right hand she gripped a wicked-looking spear. So, Xena, the goddess said, have you learned anything? Xena thought for a moment before answering. Acceptance, she replied. Athena smiled. Of what? Of who I am, of the path I've chosen, or the path that was chosen for me? A good start, Athena replied. What else? That the only real weapon I've ever had is me. My mind, my knowledge, used when the time was right. Truly the beginning of wisdom, Athena said approvingly. You still haven't told me why you felt a need to teach me this lesson, Xena said. You have gifts, Xena, and gifts such as yours don't just come from one god, such as my arrogant brother Ares. Your abilities come from all the gods, and how you use such powerful gifts must be carefully monitored. Xena nodded. I understand, she said, then added, but I don't have to like it. Xena laughed. No, she said, you don't. While acceptance and understanding are cousins, they're usually far distant relatives from enjoyment. Xena laughed too. Now that's wisdom, she said. Athena sheathed her spear across her back and grasped Xena's arm. We are sisters of a sort, Xena. Once long ago I lived and fought, and even loved as you do. There are many different types of wisdom. I wanted to make certain that you had the most important kind, wisdom of the self. You are who you are, Xena, and acceptance of that is truly wisdom of the highest order. Xena put her hand over Athena's. Thank you, she said. It's good to be reminded of that. Athena nodded, and now it's time for you to go home. When you awaken, no time will have passed, and you will know this dream for what it was, a dream. You have done well, sister. I am pleased. Rosina smiled and kept her silence. She began to feel herself floating, and looking up, or was it down? She could see Athena fading into the distance. The light grew slowly brighter, and she was eventually forced to close her eyes. It became so intense that Xena feared opening them, but then suddenly the light dimmed, and she could hear a familiar voice. Xena! Gabrielle called. Xena, wake up! Xena stirred and opened her eyes. Gabrielle, what is it? I couldn't wake you, she said. And from the way you were tossing and turning, it looked like you were having a nightmare. She peered closely at Xena. Are you all right? Xena looked around. They were in the same peaceful forest clearing where they had made camp the night before. I'm fine. What time is it? First light, Gabrielle said. Time to move on. Move on? Yes, Gabrielle said. We always move out at first light. Not today, Xena said, closing her eyes. What? Gabrielle asked. Let's sleep in, Xena replied. I'm really in no big hurry to get to the next battle. Wherever it is, I imagine we'll get there in time either way. Gabrielle frowned. Have you been drinking? Xena laughed softly. No, Gabrielle, I've been sleeping, and I'd like to do that for a while longer. If you don't mind, trouble or adventure will no doubt find us in the near future. Let's enjoy the quiet while it lasts. Gabrielle shrugged and lay down beside her companion. If you say so, though this isn't really like you, she added. Xena thought of her younger self's words. Plenty of time for sleep when you're dead. This morning is exactly like me, she murmured. Okay. I think my favorite one out of the two is the one with the little girl. Uh, okay, remember, my book's on sale at Amazon.com. Expressions of the Heart. I sent the link. I commented in the comments. I left the link, and I'm going to probably end up putting it on my page too. Wow. And next week it's only going to be one long chapter. And then I think we got two more chapters left. The other one's so long. And then one more after it. And then we'll be finished. Let me know how y'all enjoyed the book. And ciao for now.